I'm Sonia Wallace, and in this segment we're going to be talking about worms and worm farming. These guys. These are reds, blues, African night crawlers and tiger worms, and they're the ones we use in our worm farm because these guys work very, very hard and they will be producing bucket loads of this stuff. Beautiful worm castings, a wonderful soil condition for your veggie garden. So the can of worms is just one way to get started in worm farming. It's great if you don't have much space or if you're renting and want to take your worms with you when you move. It can easily fit out on a deck or even in the lounge room. To get your can of worms started, you don't need a lot of extra equipment. A few of the things here include kelp and molasses. Either of those can be diluted in a watering can and poured over the food that you're putting in the worm farm to help get that activated and get the worms consuming it quicker. Or if you're lucky enough to know somebody who's already got a worm farm, you could either use some liquid worm castings or some solid worm castings to activate your new worm farm. You'll need some food for your worms. You'll need a little bucket to hang on the front of your worm farm to collect the liquid that's going to come out of your new farm. You'll also need a little bit of newspaper just when you're first setting up your worm farm, just to line that first tray. And of course, last but not least, you're going to need some worms. Now you can buy worms commercially, but we've raided a friend's worm farm here and grabbed a couple of handfuls to kickstart this new farm. So let's take a look inside the can of worms. First up, you have a lid. This has got some air holes in it to allow for air circulation through your worm farm. Then you've got 3 trays, and each tray again has lots of holes in it for the worms to move up and down the farm and convert those raw materials you put in as food into worm castings for you. So there's 3 of those trays. And then we have the base of the worm farm. Now here you'll find a few things. There's a lump in the middle. It acts as an island. So if any of your worms end up in here, they won't drown. They can climb up the island and get back up into the worm farm. There's also air holes in all the top of the leg plugs as well to allow more ventilation through. There's also a tap at the front, and that needs to be left on so the water can drain freely from here all the time. And when you're placing your worm farm, it's great to ensure that it's got a bit of a tilt so that does drain freely so you don't get water accumulating in this bottom tray. Your worm farm belongs in the shade. It needs to be in a shaded, protected, cool spot. If you leave this out in the sun, your worms will just cook. It also needs to be protected from the rain because rain can get in through that lid, through the air holes. So it needs to be under some sort of waterproof cover so that you can maintain the amount of water going in there. So find the perfect spot for it, somewhere that's cool, shady and out away from the weather. So to get your worm farm ready, first of all grab one of the trays. Get a bit of newspaper, cut it roughly to size and place it in there. What this will do, it'll stop all the worm bedding, all the material that your worms come in, falling through into this bottom tray. So you only do this when you're first setting your worm farm up. Just put a few holes through it with a knife just to let the water and air flow through. Doesn't need much at all. And then that's ready to go as your first layer in your worm farm. So once you've got the first tray organised and a bit of newspaper in the bottom, you really just have to pour your worms in there to get them started. Next up, just give them a bit of food to get them going. Here we've just got a few cabbage leaves, and this is really great stuff. It's pulp from a juicing machine. So this kind of stuff's really good. Again, break it up into small pieces for your worms so they can start to decompose it really quickly. So a bit of food in there, not much at all, just to get them started. They're going to need to settle in first. Once you've fed them, it's great if you can pour an activator over that food. The activator will get the microbial life happening and the food will break down a lot quicker, a lot faster, so that you'll end up with a worm farm that's really productive and really healthy, no odours and no problems. So you've got your worms in there, they've got something to eat, you've poured some activator over that, so it's simply a matter now of just putting the lid on the worm farm and letting them settle in and get started. Once you've got your worm farm started, it's a matter of then maintaining it. Now your worms do need to be fed, and how much they eat depends on how many worms you start with. If you start with a lot of worms, they're going to be able to consume a lot of food. We don't have a lot of worms here to get started with, so we can just put small amounts of food in. Now you're going to have to just gauge it to see how much food your worms need. If it disappears really quickly, they can probably handle a lot more food. But if the food's just sitting around, it's going putrid, it's not being consumed very quickly, take that out, put it in the compost and start with some fresh food for them. What do you feed your worms? Well, in our kitchen we have a special bucket just for the worms, and as we're cutting up our veggies for dinner every night, we leave some for the worms and chop them up there on the cutting board and put them straight in the bucket, and that goes straight out to the worm farm. Another good thing to do with the food when you do feed the worms is to activate it. Pour something over the top of it that's going to make it really appealing to the microbes to really start getting stuck into it so it decomposes quickly and doesn't go putrid. And some of the things you can use are things like kelp, molasses, but one of the easiest things to do is just pick up the liquid worm castings out of the bucket, pour it in a watering can and pour that back over the food. Things not to put in the worm farm are things like citrus and onion. They really don't like them. So after a while, that first tray will start to fill up. It'll fill up with beautiful worm castings ready to go out in the garden. And you might want to think about putting the next layer on. So it's quite simple. It's just a matter of putting this next tray in and starting to put the food in this tray. That means the worms will come up here and start working in this area, which leaves that first tray absolutely full of beautiful worm castings with minimal worms in them, so it's easy for you to harvest and get out in the garden. Now your worm farm's going to need some water as well. There'll be water in the food scraps that you put in there, but you need to keep an eye on it and see whether you need to add some water to it as well. If it's too dry, you're going to know. There might even be ants in it. And if it's too moist, of course, that's going to be a problem as well. It'll be pretty obvious when you look at it. So if it's too moist, don't water it for a while. And if it's too dry, water it. But what you should be aiming for is castings that are about the same moisture consistency as a damp kitchen sponge. So if you can imagine what a damp kitchen sponge feels like, that's what your casting should feel like as well. They should be cool, moist, but not too wet and not too dry. Lots of different ways to worm farm though, and if you've got more space you can have things like bathtubs full of worms, or some wheelie bins can be modified to be used as worm farms, or you can have a really large scale in-ground system. But I do urge you to consider worm farming because the product you get at the end is really unique and very valuable for the soil. Plus, worms rule.